The weaning process, we basically bring them in, the ewes and lambs, and separate out the lambs from the ewes. And then basically you put your lambs into a field, ideally with good quality grass in it that is well fenced, and you move your ewes as far away from that field as you possibly can into an equally well fenced field that is, not a lush field. Obviously, we don't want to drive absolute nutrients into them and milk supply. They're going to spend the first day or two walking around the fence anyway, roaring. They're not going to eat a whole pile, as will the lambs. So I suppose that's where the fencing comes into it.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. We're joined in this week's episode by sheep specialist Michael Gottstein to discuss weaning options on farms. We discuss the current situation in farms, challenges with grass quality and quantity, and why weaning now is beneficial. We discuss the weaning process, some useful tips, and the management of ewes and lambs post-weaning. We finish up discussing some of the areas we need to address at the moment, from parasite burden, mineral supplementation to tackling lameness. We hear first from Michael.
It started a bad year and it's continuing on. I suppose a difficult year. The only positive thing I suppose is that we have very good lamb prices, but we're talking about where most farmers are at now, getting close to weaning time. Grass is tight on a lot of farms, particularly drier farms, heavily stocked farms, and what's more, the quality of grass is declining. We're coming to the time, we've arrived at the time when grass naturally starts heading out, so grass quality starts becoming an issue. And then once we start leaving the end of May, heading into June, we have those grasses heading out. So at this stage, I suppose the important thing is to take stock of where you're at, what grass you have, and prioritise the best quality grass to the animals that need it most. And I suppose look at there's a good share of lambs out there, probably a little bit behind target, and maybe often people say, look, we'll leave them on the ewes a bit longer, give them a bit more milk for a longer period of time, they'll do a bit better. The reality is they don't, they do worse. They do worse, and the reason why they do worse is because the ewes are competing with them for the good grass. So sheep are selective grazers. You'll know that when you leave sheep into a field this time of the year now, they'll go around and they'll pick out the better grass, the leafier stuff, the stuff that where they haven't urinated in the past or dunged in the past, and then it can get quite hard, and you have to leave them there a long time to graze down the rest of it. So if you leave the ewes and lambs together, your ewes are producing very little milk at this stage on most farms. So then the ewes are basically running around mopping up that leafy succulent grass and taking it from the lambs. So I suppose the benefit in leaving lambs on ewes for anything longer than kind of 10, 12, 14, certainly 14 weeks in a normal year, in a year like this where we're tight, probably 12 weeks is there's no benefit in leaving them on any longer. So really talking about, for most people, thinking about weaning ewes, and then basically prioritizing the best grass for the lambs that's on the farm.
There's probably two aspects of that. We might parse them out a wee bit. There's the ewe story, there's the lamb story. There's also the effect on grass demand, Michael. By weaning those ewes, you can drastically reduce what they're eating. You can start to build covers again. Now, look, conditions could change in the next 10 days and we might be back in the surpluses, but by and large, growth rates are tight, regrowths are slow on farms. It's one way of boosting that supply.
Yeah. So look at it, I suppose people that are tight, weaning helps because, as you said, it reduces the requirement for the ewes. We can probably cut the ewes back for a period of time there while we're drying them off as well. So for 10 days, we really reduce the demand of those ewes, right, while we're drying them off. We can then force the ewes to go around and clean up after the lambs, so it improves subsequent grass quality in the subsequent grazings. And I suppose, look, there are people out there that are tight and maybe haven't gone out with fertilizer in a while. And in that situation, they probably should go out with a little bit of fert, just to drive things on a little bit as well. So I suppose that's kind of on the grass side and the demand side of things. Then Kieran, yeah.
So look, there's a couple elements of this where it can be a useful management process as well. Basic weaning process, Michael. Top tips, things to do, things to avoid doing. How do you get to work best?
Ideally, we should be trying to kind of plan weaning and maybe have a field of nice grass lined up somewhere that's well fenced. Often I suppose we try to wean the lambs into the best fenced field on the farm to hope that when you come back out the following morning, they're still inside in the field you left them in. But most people are at the stage now where weaning is arising, so there's probably isn't time to plan for that. So look at the weaning process. We basically bring them in, the ewes and lambs, and separate out the lambs from the ewes. And then basically you put your lambs into a field, ideally with good quality grass in it that is well fenced, and you move your ewes as far away from that field as you possibly can, into an equally well fenced field that is, not a lush field. Obviously, we don't want to drive absolute nutrients into them and milk supply. They're going to spend the first day or two walking around the fence anyway, roaring. They're not going to eat a whole pile. As will the lambs, so. I suppose that's where the fencing comes into it. Better off, I suppose, Kieran, to leave the ewes outside. People often ask the question, how's the ewes? Things are a lot cleaner outside. You don't have the same level of bacterial challenge that you would have inside in a house. Inside in a house, a ewe has 2, maybe 3 square meters of space out in the field. She has 100 square meters of space, and obviously a much cleaner environment. We don't need to provide straw to keep them clean, and generally that can help reduce the risk of things like mastitis and things like that. So there's sometimes people talk about restricting water, restricting feed, or those type of things. Look at no need for that. They need access to water, especially in this type of dry weather we're getting, and the feed as well. They need some level of food. Generally, the way the drying off process works is that as the udder fills with milk, the milk will send signals to the udder to stop producing milk, and that's how the drying off procedure works. Generally, it probably takes them 3 or 4 days to stop calling for each other, the ewes and the lambs. And then I suppose the research would say that after 9 or 10 days, the ewes won't allow the lambs to suckle, even if they broke back in with each other.
So, Michael, the bear paddock, bit of distance between them, preferably maybe not beside the neighbour, good fence, and all them things are going to help. After that 2-week period, I suppose it gives us the chance as well, if there are thinner ewes there, maybe younger ewes, ewe lambs or after rearing lambs, to run them back with the lambs again. So I suppose some are wondering why we were kind of saying, the 9-10 days lambs wouldn't suckle. From a management point of view, it gives you that opportunity then to maybe run them.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, at one of the big problems we're seeing on farms is the number of thin ewes at mating time. And, it's not uncommon for us to see farms where 25-30% of the ewes are suboptimal at mating time. They're too thin, and then they're thin lambing down. Then the lambs don't thrive, problems with joint tail, all those things that we saw this spring. So a lot of that comes down to ewe condition. And, there was this old theory out there that we'd slim the ewes down and we'd fatten them up, then flush them for a couple of weeks before the ram. And the reality is that doesn't work. Ewes need time to put on weight, and they need feeding. And so, it's very important that when we wean the ewes, that weaning process, the drying off process, I suppose, is short and concise. So, a week to 10 days restricted. Mm. And then basically at that stage, we need to be going back through the ewes and picking out the thinner ones and giving them preferential grazing. So the preferential grazing is basically either they're grazing with the lambs or immediately behind the lambs, so that we're moving the lambs on a lot quicker and they're getting the second best grass, and then the ewes that are in good condition are coming back to sweep up. But it's really important, Kieran, that people keep an eye on those ewes, the thin ewes, to make sure that they're putting on weight, but also the ewes that we're using to kind of clean up, that they're not losing weight, because it's a lot more expensive to have to put weight back on again if you just lose it. So the idea really should be that we arrive next September, October, whenever we're mating the ewes, with a flock of ewes where the vast majority of them are in really good body condition. And if we can get to that stage, then basically, lambing next year in 2025 and lamb performance in 2025 will be much better and much easier. So
Um,
people have a chance now at this stage in June to take steps to kind of start rectifying those issues. We saw a lot of thin ewes coming down. With in the Better Farm program, we have flocks where 50% of the ewes were suboptimal at lambing time. So that's
yeah.
every second ewe in poor body condition lambing down, and those farmers have had horrendous problems with lamb performance and things like jointed and all of those challenges that are out there. So really important that at this stage, when we're weaning the ewes, that we say, right, this year now I'm going to make a concerted effort. We're going to look after these ewes. We're going to aim to have them all in good body condition.
Like, look, we've talked several times. It's a vicious cycle, but like that time frame, like we're in June now, and I suppose you can say we've loads of time, but in reality, we need the 2 weeks drain off. That has to happen anyway. Then you're 14, 15 weeks away. We're back in October again. It's a far shorter
Absolutely.
window, I think, than most people realise, especially
Yeah.
for trying to get those issues addressed in time.
Look at it. A ewe that needs to put on a body condition score, probably somewhere 8 to 10 kgs live weight. If you had a 35 kilo lamb and you wanted to bring it to 45 kilos, how long would it take you? Most people would be saying it would take, a good 2 months, maybe, for July, August, that time on grass alone to get that lamb. And it's the same with the ewes. We need about 2 months of good feeding to put on a body condition score on those thin ewes. If the feeding is bad, if the feeding is only average or mediocre, then we probably need twice that. We need 4 months. And the reality is most people don't have 4 months. So, it is important that we pick out those thinner ewes and we treat them preferentially so that they perform better next year. And then the fatter ewes that are obviously don't need to put on any weight, they can be used then to run around behind the groups and clean out the paddocks for us. But we still need to keep an eye on them. And I suppose people ask, when do you move everything on? It's when the last group are finished with the grass, that's when you move it on. You move everything on. So then at that stage, say if we've three, for argument's sake, we've three groups on the farm, we've got a group of lambs, a group of thinner ewes, followed by a group of fatter ewes cleaning up. It's when the fatter ewes need to be moved that the lambs move on, regardless of whether they're ready to move on. They might have still a lot of very good grass there. It's time to move them on. Thinner ewes go into the field where the lambs were, and then the fatter ewes come in where the thinner ewes were, and graze that paddock out, and that's the system for keeping on top of the quality grass. Some people use suckler cows to clean up or whatever that other stock is on the farm, but it's some sort of a system where there's different qualities feed being offered to different categories of stock. Yeah.
Okay, and look, that is something that needs to be addressed this year, and it's an opportunity to do it. Something we'll obviously come back to later in the season. We've kind of covered the ewe aspect of it. We'll talk about the lambs. So we wing the lambs. A couple of questions, Michael, that come up there. Do you split them up into males, females, different groups at a time? Should we let them settle for a period of time? Let's maybe deal with that aspect first, and then we'll come back to some of the treatments we might need to consider.
Yeah. So look at it. Drafting time, I suppose, is generally you're putting off the lambs. At that stage, I leave them in the one group just for the first week to get them to settle, and then probably bring them back in and we'll sort them out then at that stage into whatever needs to be. Look at drafting time also. There's probably 4 or 5% of the lambs that are ready to go to the factory, on most lowland farms if they've done reasonably well. If there's meal being going in, creep feeding, and there are farmers out there that are creep feeding, then probably even maybe 10% or 12% of them might be ready for drafting. So obviously you'd be drafting those lambs off the ewes, so we wouldn't be weaning today and sending the lambs to the factory having weaned them in 3 days' time, because they've spent the last 3 days walking around the field roaring for their moms. So a little bit of planning needed if I'm going weaning on Saturday. Then on the factory collection day is Wednesday. Well, then it's the Wednesday before you wean, you go. Or the alternative is that you just leave those few lambs back out with the old group, so that they're still suckling and not standing around roaring, looking for the moms losing weight for 2 or 3 days. So that's the first draft. And look, at lamb prices are high at the moment, so people should try and cash in on that. And we don't know how long, or how quickly lamb prices will start slipping. Hopefully they won't, but generally, lamb prices start dropping once we start kind of getting into June and July.
That's what, no harm as well. It's just qualified there. Like the killouts are going to be at a high period now. Obviously, not only the weight you need to handle, but you have the high point for killouts is going to decline from here on.
Yeah, so look at what we're seeing is really well fleshed lambs, intensively meal fed lambs killing out 48 to 50%. Grass fed lamb is probably 46, 47% killouts. Like, so a good guy there. If you're, a lot of people drafting there kind of 38 to 40, anything over 38 or over 40 kilos. Depends on how anxious you are and how much faith you have that the lamb price isn't going to start slipping quickly. So people who are saying, look, I'm not going to take a chance if lamb price slips quickly. I'll take a little bit of a lighter carcass weight, and I'll take my money for those lambs. And then I suppose other people are saying, well, I'll hold on a little bit longer, grow them into a little bit more weight. The downside to that, I suppose, is that if lamb price does slip, the extra weight you've put on may not compensate if the slip is significant, and we're currently at record lamb prices, I suppose. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, obviously that still has to be inspected. We're talking later here. We're talking maybe instead of 20.5 kilos, the 18.5, 19 kilos maybe in that first draft.
Yeah, look at it. Yeah, probably down to 17 kilos. Still a French carcass lamb. Yeah, look at it, if they're flesh. Yeah. If the lambs don't have flesh, thin lambs obviously don't kill as well, and then you just need to be careful. If you're going down to those lighter weights, you might get the same kill out.
So, obviously, look, what happens after that kind of settling period, it's going to be farm specific. Some might need to split up that group, maybe keeping them one group together, have spill covers again. But in that interval, look, as I said, it will vary from farm to farm, but the different options for splitting that grazing group afterwards without having too many males, females, Michael, finishing groups, when should that kick in on farms?
So look, at weaning time, I suppose you'll be weighing your lambs as well at weaning time, going through them. So you're drafting off the ones that are fit to go, and then I suppose look, it's important that we kind of have some idea as to what weight categories we have. So you can do as many groups as you want, but I suppose the more groups you have, the more complicated it gets, and the management is more complicated. Ewes versus rams, generally probably not an issue yet, and not for a while yet. So I mean, we could potentially run them together, and lots of people do. Certainly, I think a lot of farmers are probably talking about, if they haven't already started feeding meal, looking at maybe putting in a little bit of meal to lambs. This year in particular, we're seeing a lot of flocks that are kind of weaning a little bit behind where they would have been because of the poor spring. And I think in that situation, it's very beneficial if we have what I call finishing groups. So really, I'd be saying once the lambs are weaned and have settled down, bring them back in and then have a look at them, divide them up, pull off them heavier lambs into a separate group and maybe feed them a little bit of meal. Let the lighter lambs grow on grass. They're going to take a lot longer to finish. And what that does in effect, I suppose, is it reduces the amount of meal that we're putting in per lamb. Because very quickly, if we decide, Kieran, we're going to go and wean the lambs here and we put out creep feeders, especially if those lambs have eaten a bit of meal with the ewes in the springtime, they'll come onto that very, very quick. And very, very quickly, you can see yourself running up a bill there of 15 or 20 euros a lamb on concentrate feed. So by having a finishing group where you're basically picking lambs that are maybe above 30, 35 or 36 or 38 kgs, it depends on the performance of the flock, I suppose, and what target weight you're going for in terms of selling them. You're feeding them lambs, maybe 300 grams a day or up to 500 grams a day, depending on grass quality and lamb thrive and all that type of thing. The lighter lambs are running around on good grass and putting on weight, not at the same speed, but they're not costing a whole pile of money in terms of there isn't a lot of meal going in there. As we start drafting lambs from our finishing group, so this finishing group that's getting a bit of meal, as we start drafting off lambs for them for the factory or the mart or wherever they're going, we start pulling lambs from the lighter group that have grown into that weight, that 35, 36, 38 kilos, we start pulling them back into the finishing group. So as we're drafting off lambs out of the finishing group, we're pulling lambs from the lighter group into the finishing group, and they're getting a bit of meal as well. So generally what's happening then is we have this cohort of lambs that are being fed. You have another cohort of lambs, lighter lambs, that are going around on grass. And then I suppose the amount of meal that's being fed is limited to the lambs that are growing the fastest and closest to finish. So what that does is, I suppose, it reduces the amount of money we're spending on meals. It keeps a continuous flow of lambs coming ready for drafting, and welcome cash flow coming onto the farm. And then I suppose at some stage then farmers need to decide, and again, it depends. It's very farm specific, Kieran, depending on what percentage of lambs are in the different weight categories, whether all the lambs are going to be finished off the farm. Whether at some later stage in October or November we end up housing lambs to finish them indoors, or if there's an awful lot of lambs in the lighter weight groups and we know we're not going to get to finish them because they're going to compete with ewes for grass later on the year, do we look at the store market in terms of trying to sell some of those lambs live at lighter weights as stores, so as to kind of maximize the grass that's there for the ewes later on in the season? And those are all decisions that don't have to be taken now, I suppose, but certainly in what people should be doing after weaning is certainly have two groups of lambs. I think in most cases, one of them a finishing group that are getting a bit of meal, probably in most cases, and the other one then that's kind of making the most of what good quality grass is available on the farm.
It's a bit like the your body condition score story. You need a bit of planning ahead. There's no point arriving in September and realising I've nothing moved at this stage. So yeah, prior planning. Look, the final question should have probably led with this one, Michael, because some of this should have probably been in place before weaning. In terms of some of the couple of treatments that's going to keep lambs pushed on at the moment. So I'm thinking here in terms of parasite challenge is certainly something we've seen more of a parasite challenge on farms at the moment. Issues like cobalt, other minerals that are going in. Having that in place, I said, look, probably should have led with that, should have been in maybe pre-weaning, but the impact that can have as well at the moment.
Yeah. So look at it. I suppose again, it's very farm specific. Have you treated lambs for worms? Have you done them for cobalt if that's something that's needed on your farm? And lameness, a lot of lameness around. We're seeing a lot of lameness. So look at they're probably the three main things. Parasites, so the worms are the main ones we're seeing. If you are dosing for worms, is the wormer working? So all those type of questions come up. The cobalt, are they getting cobalt? Cobalt needs to go in there regularly for it to be available to the bugs in the stomach. And then lameness, a lame lamb won't thrive. No matter what you feed that lamb, if the lamb is lame, it's not going to perform. So we need to get on top of lameness. Really, I suppose if we were to people thinking about weaning maybe in the next week or 10 days, very useful, Kieran, go out beforehand now. Run the ewes and lambs into a corner in the field. After they've been settled, when you see the ewes and lambs lying out, go out, get them up with the dog, run them into, and then basically just watch the lambs defecating and pick up the lamb dung samples. Make sure you don't get any ewe ones. So you need to be quite close to them and send a few samples off to the lab, see what comes back. We should be trying to get about 10 lamb samples into a pot and send it off to the lab. It's not very expensive, 15, 20 to 25 euros. Do a worm egg count, see what comes back. If we can do that before weaning, then we'll know whether we need to dose the lambs at weaning time. Okay, so we dose if they need a dose, we dose them at weaning time. Very important then that we come back either a week later if we're using a levamisole-based product, or 2 weeks later for any of the other products, and check to see has the egg count gone. It should be reduced down to virtually zero. 95% reduction is what we're looking. If that didn't happen, then we've had a problem with either how we dosed them or what we dosed them with. Okay, and very important, I suppose, is there's a lot of people out there dosing lambs for worms. They think it's working, it's not working properly, and the lambs are still walking around with a belly full of worms, and then they're wondering why the lambs aren't thriving. And the reason why the lambs aren't thriving is because they've got a belly full of worms that are eating all the nutrients and damaging the gut. And it's really important that if we're going to treat them for worms, we make sure that the wormer is effective. Cobalt, if we're giving cobalt orally as a dose, as a drench, then basically it needs to be going in every 2 weeks. Um, and I suppose that involves a little bit of work in terms of getting the cobalt into the lambs. But look at a lot of people will be bringing in lambs every couple of weeks and drafting off lambs, and maybe it's an easy and cheap and cheerful way of doing it. It's probably the cheapest way of supplying cobalt, but it's the most labor intensive way. 6 teaspoonfuls of cobalt sulfate to a gallon of water. And give the lambs 15 mils orally, and that'll suffice. There's lots of other options out there, Kieran, for cobalt supplementation as well, boluses and cobalt in the meal and various things. But I suppose they're a little bit more expensive, but probably less labor intensive, and people can be making up their own minds. There are other mineral deficiencies, I suppose, that we see in lambs. Things like copper, selenium, iodine, all those. And look, they're very farm specific. So if you've had the vet out and identified that you have a problem with some of these, then obviously they need to be addressed. But for the vast majority of people, it's probably cobalt where it's at. And there's probably very little benefit in going with anything else. Just be careful on the copper every year, Kieran. It's rarely we find a farmer that has a problem with deficiency in copper. Generally, what we're finding is a farmer who has toxicity with copper. When we get a phone call and there's a problem, a copper-related problem, it's generally the ewes are dying because they've got too much copper rather than the opposite. So it's more common. So if you are giving copper to sheep, you would want to be pretty sure that you need to be giving copper. Don't go in there on a whim and say, sure, maybe a bit of copper won't harm them. Because we've seen cases there where people have lost a lot of sheep with copper poisoning, where they didn't need the copper going in there. And look, I mentioned it earlier, the lameness. We have a big problem with lameness in sheep, and I think we have a problem with lameness, blindness in sheep farmers, that we actually don't even see the lame sheep anymore on a lot of farms, and lame lambs don't thrive, and it's really important to get on top of the lameness. And the only way that that's going to happen is if we have an effective footbath. So it's a way that we can stand the sheep inside in a footbath for periods of time, and that we go in and treat the sheep that are really badly lame individually according to veterinary advice. Okay, so the ewe or the lamb that isn't putting its foot on the ground because it's that lame, that's not going to be treated inside any footbath. That needs to get some sort of a treatment based on a veterinary advice. So bringing in your sheep, turning up the really lame ones, identifying what's causing it. Is it scald, foot rot, or CODD, or is it some other kind of injury? And talking to your vet about what the appropriate treatment is, and getting on top of that and repeatedly treating that animal, giving it the full treatment until the lameness issue has resolved is what's going to get that lamb to thrive, or that ewe to thrive. And if we don't do that, it doesn't matter what meal we put in, what dose we give them, what mineral they get, they're not going to thrive. So those are kind of the three, what I would say as being the main things that are impacting on lamb thrive outside of the nutrition field. Would be number one, stomach worms. Number two, cobalt deficiency. In most cases, it's cobalt that we're seeing as being the problem. And number three is lameness.
Michael, we started off working covering where farms are at the moment in terms of challenges, grass being a challenge, supply being a challenge, quality being a challenge. If we looked at everything we've discussed, a lot of it is just coming back and doing some of the basic management tasks, doing them well, doing them in a timely manner. Have we got all that in place? There might be a lot of work on it for some farms this year, but there is a long-term benefit of that in terms of it kicks on to the next season as well. But it really is about doing the management tasks in time and just getting the basics right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's it. And the biggest thing here is having the facilities and timeliness. So when you see the first lambs starting to get lame with scald, if we say take a bunch of lambs now and they're pretty much lameness free, and you let them out into a field of lush grass, and after a week or two, we start seeing the first lambs showing up with scald. If at that stage those lambs are brought in and treated immediately with an effective foot bath, it'll resolve the situation with one treatment. And it'll prevent any of there'll be a whole load of lambs in that bunch that are currently not lame, but they'll be lame in a week's time because it's starting, but we're just not seeing it yet. And the foot bath will look after all that. If we wait another week, say we don't treat those lambs at that stage, and we wait another week, at that stage now, there'll be a whole pile of lambs lame. But the initial lambs that we first saw being lame, they'll be really lame, at a level that they won't be putting their foot down into the foot bath. Instead of having just a mild scald at this stage, they'll now probably have a foot rot. And now we're talking about individually treating those according to veterinary advice with antibiotics. And, and the whole, what would have been, a very quick job in terms of running the sheep into an effective foot bathing situation and getting on top of that a week ago, now becomes a big job where we probably have to repeatedly catch a number of these sheep over a period of a week and treat them repeatedly to get on top of that particular outbreak. And what we're seeing, Kieran, on a lot of the farms this year, in particular because we had such a bad spring, is that very much the level of animal performance, and in particular the level of mortality, is very much related to the infrastructure on the farm. That farmers with poor facilities, poor housing, poor handling facilities, have much higher levels of lamb mortality than farmers that have good facilities, good housing facilities, and good handling facilities. And the reason for that is because the farmers with the good facilities have less lame sheep, have ewes in better body condition, and were able to hold ewes in when the weather was bad. They weren't forced to let ewes with young lambs out in adverse weather conditions. Whereas the farmers with poor facilities had higher numbers of lame ewes, higher percentages of thin ewes that weren't going to milk, and were forced to put lambs out, because they were stuck for under pressure for housing. They had higher incidence of things like joint ill, and all of that led to a much higher level of mortality. And I suppose that's where we're at in terms of trying to set the dial back for next year, for 2025 at this stage, is getting on top of the small things, get on top of the lameness, put in a proper batch foot bathing facility on your farm so that you can you can foot bathe reasonably large numbers of sheep at a time, and do it effectively. Get on top of the body condition, and then look at the infrastructure, the housing and stuff like that. Is something that people will have to look at over time. But if we get the basics right, it is much easier to manage the sheep, and we get much higher levels of animal performance. And that starts now.
Michael, appreciate you coming on. It's something that needs to be considered on farms at the moment. Thanks for that update. You went through a lot of detail in it.
Thanks for having me on, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Michael again for coming on. He offered some very useful advice around the current situation at the moment, why weaning might be a beneficial option on farms. That's it for me for this episode. For updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.